The Hollow Crusader. The bells began ringing before dawn. Not the chapel bells. Those had gone silent 3 weeks earlier when the artillery split St. Vesper's Tower in half and buried the choir beneath hot stone. No, these were warning bells. Iron throats beaten by frightened men somewhere deeper in the trench network. They were slow and uneven, the kind rung when something had already gone wrong. Brother Private Matthew sat awake in the dugout long before the others stirred. He hadn't slept. None of them really did anymore. Sleep only meant dreams, and dreams had become dangerous near the front. Mud dripped steadily from the timber ceiling. Someone nearby coughed up blood. A man further down the trench sobbed quietly into his rosary. Matthew stared at his shaking hands. They had told him back in the cathedral cities that courage was a holy fire. That when the enemy came shrieking from the fog, with their skin stitched inside out and their mouths full of scripture, the righteous would feel God enter their hearts like a blade. But Matthew had felt nothing. Not during the bombardments, not during the charges, and not when he watched Brother Lucian pulled beneath the trench boards by pale hands that reached up from flooded tunnels beneath the earth. He only felt fear, pure animal fear. He heard boots approaching through the mud. Captain Hale ducked into the dugout, his iron crucifix armor stained black with soot. Half of his face was wrapped in bloodied cloth. "They've broken through their eastern sap," Hale said. "The 7th line collapsed an hour ago." Nobody answered. The men sat frozen in candlelight. Hale looked up at them one by one. "We hold here," a young Crusader whispered. "How many?" The captain was silent for too long. Then he said, "There's too many." That word settled into the dugout like a corpse. Hale handed out ammunition and blessings in equal measure. A touch to the forehead, a muttered prayer, a shell clip pressed into trembling hands. When he reached Matthew, he stopped. "You haven't fired your rifle in 2 days." Matthew swallowed. I've been conserving ammunition, sir." The captain stared at him. He knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew. Matthew avoided patrols, flinched at bombardments, vomited before offensives. He had joined the crusade, believing war would make him holy. Instead, it had stripped him open and shown him the small coward hiding inside. Hale leaned closer. "If this trench falls, the civilians behind us burn alive." "I know." "Do you?" Matthew said nothing. The bells outside continued ringing. Then came the scream. It wasn't human, it was far too deep. It rolled across the trench line like an animal bellowing beneath water. Men immediately began crossing themselves. One soldier started praying so fast he bit through his tongue. The bombardment hit seconds later. The dugout exploded with dirt and splintered wood. Candles died. Someone shrieked. Matthew hit the floor as the world became thunder. Then, the next shell landed closer, then another and another. The walls shook like wet paper. Captain Hale was yelling orders, but Matthew couldn't hear him anymore. His ears rang. Dirt poured onto his shoulders. The dugout felt smaller with every impact. Too small. It was too tight. He couldn't breathe. Another scream rose outside. Not one voice, but hundreds. The enemy charged. Matthew felt something inside of him break. Before he even realized he'd moved, he was climbing out of the dugout. "Matthew!" Hale shouted after him, but Matthew was already running. The trench line behind St. Vesper stretched for miles through corpse fields and black rain. Matthew stumbled through it blindly. Men rushed past him towards the front while he pushed in the opposite direction. Some screamed at him. One grabbed his shoulder and called him a deserter. Matthew struck him away and kept running. The gunfire behind him became deafening. He heard whistles and prayers, the wet chopping sounds of bayonets entering flesh. Then came the horns, low, mournful things blown by the enemy during their assaults. Matthew ran faster. He passed aid stations overflowing with limbless soldiers, past priests giving last rites to rows of children burned blind from gas exposure, past heaps of bodies stacked beside trenches because the ground was too poisoned to bury them. Everywhere he looked, men were dying for a faith Matthew no longer understood. Rain fell harder. Soon, the trench network thinned into ruined countryside. The front became distant thunder behind him. For the first time in months, Matthew found silence. He collapsed beside a shattered milestone and vomited into the mud. His chest heaved. He waited for relief, but it never came, because now there was nothing between him and what he'd done. He imagined the trench falling, imagined Captain Hale standing on top of the dugout, firing until the enemy dragged him apart. Imagine the civilians behind the lines screaming as the invaders entered the city. And through all of it, one truth clawed at him. He had abandoned them. Matthew began to cry. Not loudly, just quietly into the rain. Hours passed before he forced himself back onto his feet. Night was coming, and he needed shelter. Ahead, beyond dead trees and drifting fog, he spotted a small chapel standing alone beside the road. Its bell tower was broken. Candles flickered faintly behind stained glass. Matthew nearly wept with relief. He staggered towards it. The chapel doors opened before he could knock. An old priest stood within, thin, pale eyes, clouded white, with blindness. "You've come from the front," the priest said softly. Matthew nodded. The old man smiled sadly. "They always do." Inside, the chapel smelled of incense and rot. Several civilians sat silently in pews beneath blankets. Refugees, perhaps. None looked at Matthew as he entered. The priest shut the doors behind him. "You are safe here tonight." Safe. The word nearly shattered him. Matthew sat near the altar and warmed himself beside a tiny stove. The refugees remained motionless in the shadows. "You fled," the priest said after a while. Matthew froze. "I can always tell." The young Crusader stared into the fire. I thought I was strong enough." "No one is." "I left them there." Yes, you did." No anger and no judgment. That somehow made it worse. Matthew rubbed his eyes. "I was afraid." The blind priest tilted his head. "As was St. Gladius when they peeled the skin from his hands. As was St. Varial when the insects nested in his lungs. Fear is not the sin." Matthew looked up. "Then what is?" The priest smiled faintly. "Running from what fear demands." Silence settled over the chapel. Outside, thunder rolled across distant battlefields. Matthew eventually drifted into exhausted sleep beside the stove and dreamed. He stood once more in the trenches, only they were empty now. No soldiers and no gunfire, just endless mud beneath a dead sky. Something moved beyond the fog, shapes, tall and thin, human but stretched wrong. They walked slowly towards him, carrying lanterns made from skulls. Matthew tried to run. His boots sank deep into the mud. The figures kept coming, closer, so very close. Then he saw their faces. Everyone belonged to a man from his trench. Captain Hale, Brother Lucian, the young Crusader who bit his tongue. All dead, all staring at him, their mouths open together, and from every throat came the same words: "You left us." Matthew woke screaming. The chapel was dark. The fire had died. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he heard chewing. It was slow, wet. He looked towards the pews. The refugees were standing now. Dozens of pale eyes reflected faint moonlight. One woman tore strips of flesh from something cradled in her lap. A child nearby gnawed on a human hand. Matthew recoiled in horror. The blind priest stood near the altar, smiling gently. "They came to me, hungry," he whispered. The room filled with the smell of blood. They fled the war too. The refugees began turning towards Matthew, one by one. Their mouths were black with rot. Their skin hung loose like damp paper. They were afraid, the priest continued. Just like you. Matthew staggered backwards. What are you? The priest's blind eyes rolled upward. Abandoned. The chapel bells began ringing, though Matthew saw no ropes moving. The refugees advanced slowly down the aisle. Bones cracked beneath their feet. Matthew threw himself against the chapel doors. They would not open. Behind him came soft footsteps. The priest spoke near his ear now. Do you know what waits for cowards after death, Crusader? Matthew spun around. The old man's mouth had split impossibly wide. Inside was only darkness. No tongue, no throat. Just a pit descending forever. You are about to learn. The candles extinguished all at once, and in the darkness, the refugees fell upon him. 3 days later, soldiers from a rear patrol discovered the chapel beside the road. It was empty, abandoned. No priests, no refugees, only blood. And nailed above the altar with rusted bayonets was Brother Private Matthew. He was still alive, but just barely. His eyes had been sewn shut with wire. His mouth hung open in a permanent scream, and carved deep across his chest in ragged letters were the final words he would ever carry. Cowards are remembered longer than martyrs.